Principle number 6, individuals should not be deterred from making requests for information by excessive costs. Sean's answered that. Meetings of public bodies should be open to the public. Well, there have been several departmental meetings to which I have been invited that I have not attended on the grounds that I was told that they were closed meetings. I don't think that that's a good way for government departments to operate. Disclosure takes precedence. Laws which are inconsistent with the principle of maximum disclosure should be amended or repealed. The idea is that subsequent legislation should be read in the light of the principle of disclosure. This is not how we go about things here. The later legislation must specifically bring in the FOI, otherwise it doesn't necessarily, the later legislation doesn't necessarily create a body caught by FOI. And finally, individuals who release information on wrongdoing, that is to say, whistleblowers, should be protected. We have no whistleblower protection legislation. Not only that, but we have a decision by the last government not to introduce a Public Interest Disclosure Act, that it would be better to do it on an individual case-by-case, industry-by-industry or issue-by-issue basis. And since then, there have been no public interest disclosure sections in legislation published and enacted by this government. If we apply these principles to the hypothetical with which I started, we find that it would cost me a fortune if I wanted to find out about financial decisions being taken, and anyway, I probably couldn't find that out. As a consequence, I suspect that my hypothetical would fail all 9 of those UNESCO principles. Thank you very much.
So, who would like to start? Oh, straight away. Who would like to start off? And if you have a question, make sure you get my attention. I'll make sure you're in the queue. If your first name and your question, please.
My name is Carl. I have a question. The first part is for Gavin and the second part for Sean. Gavin, if you were able to make 3 small changes in the way that freedom of information requests are done in the morning, if you just had the power to do it, bearing in mind budgetary constraints and operational constraints that the information officer has, what would they be? And the second bit for Sean is based on Gavin's answers. Can you tell us why your office, for instance, can't, won't, or don't make changes like that in the next 2 or 3 months?
The first thing is the fees. The amount of money that's taken in by, say, the main government departments is actually quite small, relatively speaking. I think the fees are merely, were deliberately, I believe, inserted just to create a barrier to information. I don't think there's any, I mean, I often send in a request with a €15 check. I'm still sending letters with checks in 2010, which I think is strange. I can email in the request, but I still have to mail a check, which is another problem. But oftentimes I'll get a reply with a registered letter, which costs €5. So €10 of the money is €5. A third of the money has already been spent on sending the reply, and I'm kind of a lot of, I mean, even the sense that I have to spend €75 to appeal and a search and retrieval fee that might be €1,500, or even if a search and retrieval fee is like €100, and I think that's not justified. I have to pay €75 for that appeal, and even if I win, I don't get the €75 back. So that's the first change I'd make, would be the cost structure. I think it's totally unjustified. Within reason. I mean, I'd copy the British system, and I look at the British system an awful lot. I look at British history a lot, British case history a lot. In Britain, if the search and retrieval fee is over £600, then, and all the requests are free, and all internal reviews are free, appeals to the Information Commissioner are free as well. If it's over £600, then the body in question can say no, but we'll help you reduce it so that it comes under that £600 limit. The second thing I would change is is what Eoin was saying. Bring more bodies under the Act. At the moment, all the VECs, particularly the Garda Síochána, we're the only country in the Western world where the police force isn't under some right to information legislation. I think it's the entire OECD basically has some way of getting information out of your police force, including countries like Azerbaijan, Georgia, Dagestan. I mean, it's widespread, and yet Ireland stands out alone in Europe that we can't get information from our police force. The same is true of the financial regulator, the NTMA, NAMA, the central bank, all the VECs, which are supposed to come under later this year, all the port companies, I mean, there's a huge range of bodies. The one thing that I should say to Eoin is that I have looked into the issue of FOI in relation to NAMA and Anglo, and I started the process 8 months ago, which was using the Access to Information and the Environment legislation, which is a separate legislation to this conversation, but it's essentially the same idea. That and the difference being, the critical difference being, that a public authority is, everything is a public authority within reason. So I'm arguing that NAMA is a public authority because of the duties it's going to be carrying out over the next decade. The same is true of Anglo, because the shares are held by the minister, it's a public authority. And the access to information on the legislation was only introduced in 2007, and Emily O'Reilly has indicated frequently that it's almost not used at all. It's not used at all by anybody in the country, really, because nobody's aware of it. The third thing I change with the FOI legislation, I think, would be try and get rid of it. We really have to change our attitude towards information that is really de facto public. I mean, it's one thing having a mechanism for me to get information from public bodies, but the mechanism should be so limited that it shouldn't be required in a way, because the information is public. By default, the information should be just published online in a timely manner, and that's it. And if it's information that isn't published, then I should have a mechanism through which I can argue that information should be released. And that's, to me, a better scenario. It's similar to what they have in Sweden. Other countries are moving towards this. There's a piece of legislation in the US that's going through Congress called the Public Online Information Act. And essentially what that legislation says is that where public documents are in folders and are published and are on computers, that the default situation is that the information is published rather than having some mechanism for citizens to ask their government for information that they're entitled to, I believe, by and large anyway.
Gavin, thank you very much. And Sean?
Okay,
the
the simple answer is that we have no responsibility for legislation. The legislation is brought in and administered by the Department of Finance, subject to the Minister for Finance. So we have absolutely no role regarding bringing in legislation or not. Our job is to ensure that the Act as it stands is properly implemented. Now, what the Commissioner has done, and I would echo many of Gavin's comments on that, the Commissioner has gone on public record many times, as I said in my opening remarks, being critical of the introduction of fees, which the Commissioner sees as a disincentive to use of FOI. The Commissioner has also, over the last several annual reports, has called for specific bodies to be brought under legislation, including in particular in Garda Síochána. The PSNI have been brought in since its inception, so why can't the Guards be in? So that's also an issue for the Commissioner. The third point Gavin made was that there shouldn't be an FOI Act because we should be in a culture of openness that would need people doesn't have to have recourse to a piece of legislation to get information. The intention in the FOI Act was to lead towards such a culture, and I'll leave it to yourselves to judge how far along that road we are as a state. But on the basic point is our office and the Commissioner has no role regarding introduction of the legislation. Our job is to implement it. So we cannot and we are not in a position to change the Act. We can recommend changes. The Commissioner has done this in many cases, but it's ultimately a decision for the Minister of Finance whether or not to change the Act, including, as Eoin has said, whether or not to bring in bodies, anti-May, NAMA and so on.
Can I just ask a clarification?
Sure.
Yeah, please.
Gavin has alluded to the fact that you have to write in, send in checks. Apart from having no responsibility, would it be a case that the office could say facilitate online payments or accepting applications by email or sending electronic files in their correspondence?
Well, to be honest, that's I would look at that. That's not our statutory role. Whether or not us as a public body can set our systems up to take online payments is one thing. We don't. I have no idea why, but I know we don't, and I know it's a cause of annoyance for people. I have simply no idea why we don't, can't, won't do that. But the fact is, we don't.
And the answer to that is we'll probably have to build it ourselves. In other words, we'll have to build. In the UK, there's a website called whatdotheyknow.com, which acts as a proxy to sending requests to UK government bodies. And the biggest barrier to us replicating that software or website in Ireland is the paywall issue. So it's a significant issue. You could build a website for people to send in requests to any public body if you wanted, as long as the paywall wasn't there, because you have to send in a check. And it wouldn't be that difficult to make a website that you could do that if the departments were in agreement and if the public bodies were in agreement.
Mel, just wondering if Andrew, Gavin and Eoin could in their own way tell us who they think does it best internationally.
From looking at Sweden is probably always the example that's given. I mean, the right to information culture, like, I mean, Brazil just passed its right to information legislation this year. Nepal has right to information legislation. I mean, it's widespread all over the world. I think some countries are better than others. I think probably the best default situation of disclosure is Sweden that I've come across. But it's amazing, countries that you might imagine have a good right to information culture or legislation don't. Germany has worse legislation than we do. I mean, they don't have the charges that we do, but they have a kind of a more significant culture of public sector secrecy compared to us. So it's not all bad, but we still have serious problems I think we have to deal with.
Owen, your thoughts on
Well,
that?
I'm going to fall back on the UNESCO principles that I referred to, and for a country I was going to mention Sweden. So I'm just going to agree with Gavin.
The right to information legislation is 300 years old.
Great, thank you. And Sean?
Oh,
Who do we model ours on then?
we modelled ours on a combination of Canada, Australia and New Zealand, but ironically, in a reversal of the normal historical trend in legislation, the British British UK Act is based on ours. They used ours as the model. As Gavin said, there are significant differences in implementation, but as taking a piece of legislation, they used ours as the basis for theirs.
Well, they used ours before it was amended.
Yeah.
So it was the original process rather than the post-2003 amendments that they based themselves on. And what's his name? Tony Blair, the week before last, when he was giving various interviews to the television, the radio, and newspapers about his memoirs, pointed out or said that this was the biggest mistake he made in government. Now, we can all probably come up with bigger mistakes that Tony Blair made in government, but that he felt that having too broad an FOI legislation made it difficult for government to do its job. So his biggest regret as Prime Minister was promoting FOI legislation. So perhaps they're going to follow our lead not only in the original Act, but also in the restrictions on the Act as well.
I think just on that point, the UK has their Act is much newer, but the way they do it is, I think I actually do UK FOIs, so I have a point of reference to compare doing an Irish process to the UK process. UK process, you send an email. They send you a reply within 2 days and say, we have got your request, we are dealing with it. And you'll generally get a reply before the 20 working days has expired. You'll get your result of your FOI, electronically usually. The other thing is that we have 3 different offices. We have a Data Protection Commissioner, an Information Commissioner, and a Commissioner for Environmental Information, as well as the Ombudsman, which three of those are mixed kind of in overlapping roles. The UK system has the Data Protection Commissioner, the Information Commissioner, and the Commissioner for Environmental Information all in the same office. So when you go through a process of asking for information, the first thing they'll do is say, well, is this under FOI? Is this under environmental legislation? Or is there data protection issues around this? So they have a much more holistic approach, whereas ours is kind of fragmented.
Thank you very much, Mel. Gillian.
I just have a comment and a question. Firstly, I think the FOI, I know there's been problems with it, but I think it has changed culture within the civil service where to the point where press queries come in to the department, in my experience anyway, that they would say, is it FOI? Well, are you going to get it under FOI? And they are. Let's give them information, which I think is, personally think is a great thing. But I have a question as well for Sean, is that our texts FOI?
By text, you mean text messages?
Messages on mobile phones.
Good question. I would say that yes, they are, if they're retained, if they're kept. The issue that I would see is there's no way of knowing whether or not a person has kept their texts. But yes, the starting position is yes, they would be. If it's an official mobile, officially paid for and all the rest of it, yes.